That little thing? You think she can handle the recoil on a Barrett M82? She'll be lucky if it doesn't dislocate her shoulder and send her crying back to the admin pool, where she belongs to the crowd of hardened soldiers, their faces etched with the fatigue of a long desert training rotation, chuckled nervously. The voice belonged to Sergeant Major Thorne, a man whose physical presence was as loud and uncompromising as his opinions. He stood like a monument carved from granite and arrogance, his arms crossed over a barrel chest, a sneer twisting his lips as he gestured with his chin toward the lone figure at the firing line. The woman in question offered no reaction. She stood perfectly still, a slim silhouette against the shimmering heat rising from the baked earth of the advanced marksmanship range. Her uniform, though properly fitted, seemed to hang on a frame too slight for the brutal physics of long-range ballistics. She was an island of calm in a sea of testosterone and quiet skepticism, her focus absolute, her silence a stark rebuttal to the sergeant major's public dismissal. The other snipers, a collection of grizzled veterans and ambitious young marksmen, shuffled their feet, their eyes darting between the unmoving woman and the pontificating instructor. They had all heard of Thorne's reputation for washing out anyone he deemed unworthy, a judgment he often made in the first 5 minutes based on criteria that had more to do with prejudice than performance. But there was something else in the air today, an undercurrent of anticipation. From a shaded command vehicle parked 100 yards back, General Maddox watched the scene unfold through a pair of stabilized binoculars, his expression unreadable. He had seen 1,000 instructors like Thorne and 1,000 quiet professionals like the woman now being ridiculed. He lowered the optics slightly, focusing on the way she stood, her posture not one of military rigidity, but of relaxed, practiced alignment. It was a stance he recognized, a subtle language of the body, spoken only by those who had spent a lifetime in communion with a rifle. He saw the way her hands rested, not clenched, but loose, ready. He saw the almost imperceptible way she tested the wind with a glance at the distant heat mirage, her mind a silent supercomputer of environmental calculation. The general knew that true lethality wasn't loud. It was methodical. It was patient. It was silent. If you believe that true strength is measured not in words but in actions, type competence in the comment below. The challenge laid out by Sergeant Major Thorne was designed to be more of a theatrical humiliation than a genuine test of skill. A single target, a standard 10-inch steel plate, was positioned at a distance that stretched the very definition of possibility, 2,150 yards. It was a speck of white against a canvas of brown, rendered almost invisible by the dancing, distorting waves of heat. To hit it with a .50 caliber BMG round from the M82 Barrett was not just a matter of skill. It was a conversation with physics, a negotiation with wind, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and even the subtle rotation of the earth. It was, as Thorne had loudly declared to the assembly, a shot for legends, not for lightweights. He delighted in the collective murmur of disbelief from the trainees. This was his stage, and he was the master of ceremonies. He strode over to the waiting M82, a monstrous piece of engineering resting on its bipod, and patted its receiver with a proprietary air. "This," he announced, his voice booming across the range, "is the Thor's hammer of rifles. It requires strength. It requires an iron will. It demands respect." His eyes locked onto the silent woman. "Let's see if our candidate has any of those qualities." His condescension was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. The woman, whose name no one had bothered to ask, simply walked forward. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost hypnotic. There was no hesitation, no wasted energy. Her steps were deliberate, her presence shrinking the vast, intimidating space of the firing line into her own personal workshop. The other soldiers watched, their initial amusement curdling into a tense curiosity. They saw her approach the massive rifle, a weapon that looked like it could snap her in two, and their assumptions began to whisper doubts in their minds. Her silence was unnerving. It wasn't the silence of fear or intimidation. It was the silence of profound concentration, a state of being so focused that the outside world, with all its noise and judgment, simply ceased to exist. She didn't look at Thorne. She didn't acknowledge the gallery of staring eyes. Her entire universe had contracted to the rifle, the distant target, and the invisible river of air that flowed between them. General Maddox, still observing, felt a familiar thrill. He had seen this before, this deep, meditative state. It was the mark of a master, an artist preparing their canvas. Thorne was trying to stage a public execution of a career, but the general had a growing suspicion that the sergeant major had unwittingly handed the executioner's axe to his intended victim. She began her preparation, and it was a ritual of such refined precision that it bordered on reverence. Every movement was a study in practiced efficiency, a muscle memory ballet honed over countless hours in places far less forgiving than this sun-drenched training range. Her hands, which Thorne had implicitly dismissed as too delicate, moved with the steady, confident grace of a surgeon. She first adjusted the bipod, not with a rough shove, but with minute deliberate clicks, ensuring each leg had a perfect purchase on the hard-packed dirt, creating a foundation of absolute stability. She then settled behind the rifle, her body flowing into the earth, becoming an extension of the weapon itself. She didn't fight the rifle's weight. She merged with it, her slight frame distributing the pressure with an expert's understanding of leverage and bone support. The soldiers watched, their whispers dying into a collective, held breath. They were witnessing something far beyond the standard doctrine taught in field manuals. Thorne, for his part, maintained his sneer, but a flicker of uncertainty had entered his eyes. He had expected fumbling, hesitation, a struggle with the sheer mass of the weapon system. He was seeing none of it. He watched as she produced a small, worn Kestrel weather meter from a pouch, holding it aloft for a moment. But then, in a move that baffled everyone, she put it away. She didn't even seem to consult the reading. Instead, she plucked a single blade of dry grass from the ground beside her and let it fall from her fingers, her eyes tracking its gentle, spiraling descent. She was reading the wind the old way, the instinctive way, feeling the microcurrents and thermal drafts that the electronic device could never fully capture. She then turned her attention to the scope, her fingers dancing over the elevation and windage turrets. The clicks were sharp, audible, each one a precise calculation translated into mechanical reality. Click, click, click. The sound was a metronome counting down to the moment of truth. She wasn't guessing. She was dialing in a known solution to a complex problem she had already solved in her head. She opened the bolt of the M82, the sound of heavy, oiled steel sliding against steel echoing in the profound silence. From a small pouch on her belt, she retrieved a single round of 50 BMG ammunition. It was not a standard issue ball round. The soldiers closest to her could see the projectile was a specific match-grade variant, its copper jacket polished to a sheen. She slid the massive cartridge into the chamber and closed the bolt with a solid, final thud. The sound sealed her in a bubble of concentration. The world outside vanished. There was only her breathing, the reticle, and the distant mirage. The final moments before the shot were a masterclass in control. She settled her cheek against the stock of the rifle, the warm material of familiar comfort. Her breathing slowed, each inhalation and exhalation becoming longer, deeper, a rhythmic cycle of calm that seemed to push the tension out of the air. Through the high-powered optic, the world was a compressed, shimmering landscape. The target, a tiny white rectangle, swam in and out of focus through the waves of heat. To the assembled soldiers, she appeared utterly motionless, a statue of intent. But inside that stillness, 1,000 micro-adjustments were being made. Her trigger finger rested lightly, feeling the delicate break point of the mechanism. Her non-dominant eye was open, scanning the periphery, absorbing information about the subtle shifts in the light and wind that are focused I might miss. She was not just looking at the target. She was sensing the entire 2-kilometer path the bullet would have to travel. Sergeant Major Thorne stood with his arms still crossed, his posture a fortress of defiance against the growing evidence that he had made a terrible, career-defining misjudgment. The nervous laughter had long since evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere of intense, almost unbearable suspense. Every soldier on that range, from a newest recruit to the most seasoned instructor, was now locked onto her, their own breathing shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence stretched, becoming heavier with each passing second. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a living entity, a deafening pressure that amplified every tiny detail. The buzz of an insect, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft rustle of canvas in the breeze. Then it happened. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, between a final, controlled exhalation and the stillness of her lungs, she pressed the trigger. The eruption of the M82 was a cataclysmic event. A thunderous roar shattered the silence, a physical shockwave that slammed into the chests of the onlookers and kicked up a plume of dust and sand around her. The recoil, the immense force that Thorne had predicted would shatter her shoulder, was absorbed seamlessly into her body. She rode the violent kick with the fluidity of a dancer, her frame moving with the rifle, not against it, her eye never leaving the scope. For a long, agonizing second and a half, the world held its breath. The massive 50 caliber projectile, a 700-grain piece of precision machine metal, tore through the air at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, spinning at thousands of revolutions per second. It began its majestic parabolic arc, climbing and then falling, fighting the pull of gravity and the relentless push of the crosswind she had so expertly judged. Then, a sound returned across the vast distance, a sound that was impossibly small, yet resonated with the finality of a death knell. A sharp, clear metallic ping. It was a sound of absolute, undeniable success. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Binoculars and spotting scopes, already trained on the target, confirmed the impossible. Dead center. A perfect, clean hole punched through 10 inches of hardened steel. The silence that followed was different. It was a silence born not of suspense, but of pure, unadulterated awe. Sergeant Major Thorne stood frozen, his jaw slack, the arrogant sneer melted from his face, replaced by a mask of utter disbelief. "No," he whispered, the word lost in the vastness. "No way, that's not possible." General Maddox lowered his binoculars, a slow, satisfied smile gracing his lips. He knew that sound. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of vindication. He keyed the radio on his vehicle. "Sergeant Major Thorne, my position." Now the command was quiet, devoid of anger, yet carried an authority that brooked no argument. Thorne, jolted from his stupor, turned and began the long, humiliating walk toward the general's command vehicle, his face pale under his tan. The other soldiers remained frozen, their eyes fixed on the woman who was now methodically clearing the M82, her movements just as calm and precise as they had been before the shot. She ejected the spent casing, its brass glinting in the sun as it fell to the dirt, and secured the weapon. She had not looked at the crowd. She had not smiled. She had simply performed her task. As Thorne reached the general's vehicle, Maddox stepped out, holding a tablet. He didn't look at the sergeant major. His eyes were on the woman, who was now standing up, brushing the dust from her uniform. "You know, Thorne," the general began, his voice dangerously soft, "I've been in this man's army for 35 years. I've seen good soldiers, great soldiers, and a few legends. One of the things you learn is that legends rarely announce themselves. They don't need to." He finally turned his gaze to Thorne, his eyes like chips of ice. "You, on the other hand, are very loud." He tapped the screen of the tablet, pulling up a personnel file. He handed it to Thorne. "Read it." Thorne took the tablet, his hands trembling slightly. The file was for Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova. He scanned the basic information, but then his eyes fell upon a small, unobtrusive insignia displayed next to her name. It was a simple, stylized arrowhead, wreathed in lightning. Thorne's breath caught in his throat. He knew that symbol. Every soldier in the Special Operations community knew it. It was the unit crest for the Army's most elite, most secretive, and most lethal sniper element. A Tier 1 Special Missions unit so classified that its very existence was a subject of myth and rumor. They were the ghosts of the battlefield, the quiet professionals sent to solve problems that no one else could. They were, without exaggeration, the best in the world. As this realization crashed down on him, General Maddox walked past the stunned sergeant major and approached Rostova directly. He moved with a purpose that silenced the remaining whispers. The soldiers parted before him like the sea, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning comprehension. General Maddox stopped a respectful 3 paces from Sergeant Rostova. He did not speak. Instead, he simply looked at her, his gaze taking in the subtle details that Thorne's arrogance had blinded him to. He saw the faint, almost invisible scar above her right eyebrow, a testament to a past engagement. He saw the quiet confidence in her eyes, a look that could only be earned in the crucible of real-world operations. He saw the small, faded patch on her sleeve, partially obscured by a pocket flap. With a gentle movement, he reached out and brushed the flap aside, revealing it fully. It was the same wreathed arrowhead from her file, the elite sniper unit badge, the symbol of a master. The general froze for a calculated, dramatic beat, ensuring every eye was on that small piece of embroidered cloth. He let the weight of its meaning settle over the crowd. Then, slowly, with a precision that mirrored Rostova's own, he brought his hand up in a sharp, formal salute. It was not the casual salute of a general to a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, unwavering respect. The salute of one warrior acknowledging another. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice now carrying across the silent range, clear and authoritative. "My apologies for the unprofessional welcome you've received at my facility." He held the salute, his eyes locked with hers. Rostova, who had remained impassive throughout the entire ordeal, finally met his gaze. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. She returned the salute with the same crisp formality. "Thank you, General," she replied, her voice steady and clear, the first words anyone had heard her speak beyond a simple acknowledgement. The general dropped his salute and turned to face the assembled soldiers and the utterly mortified Sergeant Major Thorne, who was still standing by the vehicle as if he'd been turned to stone. "Let me be perfectly clear for everyone here," Maddox announced, his voice ringing with the authority of command. "You are looking at Sergeant First Class Eva Rostova. Her last operational tour involved 72 confirmed engagements, all at distances exceeding 1,200 yards. She holds the 3rd longest confirmed sniper kill in the history of the United States military. Her mission classifications are so far above your pay grade that if I told you what they were, I'd have to classify this entire desert." He paused, letting the information sink in. "She is not here to qualify. She is here on my personal invitation to evaluate our advanced training protocols and rewrite them. That weapon," he gestured to the M82, "was designed by men, but it was perfected by warriors. Warriors like her." He turned his piercing gaze directly onto Thorne. "Sergeant Major, you made an assumption based on what you saw, not on what you knew. You confused appearance with ability. You mistook quiet professionalism for weakness. You have not only embarrassed yourself, you have insulted a decorated hero and failed every single soldier on this range by teaching them that prejudice is an acceptable substitute for judgment. Your lesson for today is over. Sergeant Rostova is now in charge." The story of what happened on that range spread with the speed of a desert wildfire. It was whispered in hushed, reverent tones in the barracks that night. It was recounted with a mixture of shame and awe in the NCO club. It became an email, then a text, then a legend passed from one unit to the next. "The shot heard round the base," they called it. It wasn't just a story about a remarkable feat of marksmanship. It was a parable. It was a lesson in humility, a stark reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least. Sergeant Major Thorne underwent a transformation that was as profound as it was public. The next morning, he appeared before the assembled trainees, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a quiet, raw humility. He formally, and without reservation, apologized to Sergeant Rostova in front of everyone. He admitted his failure, his prejudice, his arrogance. But he didn't stop there. He requested that Rostova lead the remainder of the training course. "I have been teaching the same way for 20 years, he told the class, his voice thick with emotion. "And in 5 minutes yesterday, Sergeant Rostova taught me that I know nothing about the true nature of a warrior." Your real training begins now, Rostova, for her part, accepted his apology with a simple, gracious nod. She deflected the praise and adulation that came her way, her focus remaining squarely on the mission General Maddox had given her. She did not lead with speeches or bravado. She led with competence. She broke down the complex art of long-range shooting into its purest elements: breathing, patience, mathematics, and an intimate understanding of the environment. She taught the trainees to listen to the wind, not just measure it. She taught them that the rifle was not a tool of brute force, but an instrument of precision, an extension of their own will. She spent extra time with a young, nervous-looking sniper who was struggling with his confidence, a soldier Thorne had been on the verge of washing out. She didn't berate him. She quietly observed, identified a minor flaw in his posture, and with a few soft-spoken words, corrected a mistake that had plagued him for months. Under her tutelage, the young soldier began to excel, his shots finding their mark with newfound consistency. The physical evidence of her legend began to take shape. The steel plate she had shot, with its perfect .50 caliber puncture, was removed from the range. It was mounted on a polished wooden plaque and hung in the main briefing hall. Beneath it, a simple brass plate was engraved. The Rostova shot, 2,150 yards. Let silence be your argument, and out on the range itself, the firing point from which she had made the impossible shot was given a new designation. A sign was staked in the ground, its letters stenciled in stark black paint. Rostova's Perch. It became a hallowed place, a spot where new snipers would go to reflect, to remember the day that a quiet professional reminded an entire base what true strength looked like. The ripple effects of that day continued to expand, creating a lasting change in the culture of the institution. Sergeant Major Thorne, once a gatekeeper of the old guard, became one of Rostova's most fervent disciples. He completely overhauled his own teaching philosophy, incorporating her lessons on quiet competence and the dangers of assumption into every class he taught. He began to champion soldiers who didn't fit the traditional mold, looking for the quiet diligence and methodical focus that were the true hallmarks of an expert, rather than the loud confidence he had once prized. He would often point to the plaque in the briefing hall and tell the story, always ending it the same way: "I was the fool in that story. Don't be me. Look for the warrior, not the uniform." The young soldier Rostova had personally mentored went on to become one of the top marksmen in his class, his quiet confidence now rooted in proven skill. He never forgot her lesson, not just in shooting, but in leadership. He learned that true mentorship wasn't about shouting, but about observing, listening, and offering precise, effective guidance. He carried her philosophy of action over words with him throughout his career, becoming a leader known for his calm demeanor and unshakable competence under pressure. The legend of Rostova's Perch grew. It became a rite of passage for snipers training at the facility. Before their final qualification, they would spend an hour at the firing point, in silence, contemplating the principles she embodied. It was a place to meditate on the profound difference between noise and signal, between arrogance and confidence, between seeing and truly observing. The story became a mandatory part of the orientation for all new personnel arriving at the base, a foundational myth that set the tone for the standards of professionalism expected of them. General Maddox used the incident as a teaching point across his entire command, a perfect, real-world example of the core values he sought to instill in his leaders. He saw in Rostova the embodiment of the ideal soldier for the modern era: adaptable, intelligent, and lethal, defined not by their physical stature or their volume, but by the undeniable results of their actions. Her presence, though brief, had been a catalyst, forcing an entire community to reevaluate its most basic assumptions and to rediscover a fundamental truth: that respect is something that must be earned, moment by moment, through the quiet, consistent, and relentless application of professional excellence. Her legacy wasn't just a plaque on a wall or a name on a firing point. It was in the changed minds of hundreds of soldiers, a cultural shift towards a deeper, more meaningful definition of strength. Years passed. The sun-bleached sign marking Rostova's Perch was replaced with a more permanent, engraved stone marker. Sergeant Major Thorne retired, but not before personally training the instructor who would take his place, ensuring the lessons he had learned so harshly would continue to be taught. General Maddox moved on to a higher command, but he would often tell the story of the quiet sergeant who single-handedly recalibrated the soul of his old training base. The story of Eva Rostova became institutional folklore, a touchstone for a new generation of soldiers who had never met her but knew her by her actions. They knew of the impossible shot, of the public humbling of an arrogant instructor, and of the quiet authority of a true professional. Her name became synonymous with competence. To pull a Rostova became shorthand for achieving a spectacular result with zero fanfare, for letting the work speak for itself. The legend served as a constant, powerful reminder that the most critical battlefield is often the one within our own minds, the fight against our own prejudices and assumptions. It taught that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, for its presence is felt in its effects. It demonstrated that a legacy is not built on the volume of one's voice, but on the precision of one's actions. Eva Rostova herself was a ghost. Her name would occasionally surface in heavily redacted after-action reports, a footnote in operations of global significance, before disappearing back into the classified shadows. She never sought recognition, never returned to the base. She didn't need to. Her work was done. She had left behind something more powerful than a memory. She had left behind a standard of silent, unwavering excellence. A standard that taught everyone that the most profound statements are often made without speaking a single word. A standard that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that in the calculus of a warrior's worth, competence is the only variable that truly matters. The true measure of a legacy isn't what you leave behind in plaques and stories, but what continues to move forward in the actions of others. The spirit of Eva Rostova's quiet professionalism lived on, not as a static tale, but as an active principle. It was present in every instructor who chose to mentor a struggling,